Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Asad Lalji, and thank you for being here with us this evening, braving the crowds, the traffic, and the morchas. But thank you. We're very overwhelmed by the number of people who actually showed up. Welcome to Building Bombay, Business Families and the City, brought to you by Avid Learning in association with the NGMA. This program is a continuation of Avid's collaboration with the NGMA, and I'd like to thank Mr. Kenneth and his team for this opportunity. I don't know if they're here. Today's panel discussion celebrates the contributions to nation building of various businesses and industrialist families of Bombay and their lasting legacies and influence on the cosmopolitan history of our city. Our panel of experts will discuss prominent business families from various communities, which are not just significant in the economic context, but also educational, cultural, and philanthropic. This discussion is part of Avid's Multipolis Mumbai series, which decodes the past while looking to the future and finding novel ways of engaging, interacting with, and re-energizing the city we love. Today, historian and professor Dinyar Patel, historian Murali Ranganathan, editor special features of the Economic Times Vikram Doctor, will be in conversation with historian and blogger at bombaywala.org, Simeen Patel. I do hope you enjoy the discussion. We generally encourage people to post, repost, tweet, be social, tag, but I don't think you're going to get any signal in this room. So when you go out, please do so. Our handles are at Avid Learning, and our hashtag is Learning Never Stops. Now, Ursula is going to tell you a little bit more about each of our panelists. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A little bit about each of our panelists before they begin the discussion. Dinyar Patel is an assistant professor of history at the University of South Carolina, where he teaches courses on Indian history and the British Empire. He completed his PhD in history from Harvard University in 2015. He is a co-editor of 2 published volumes, From Ghalib's Delhi to Lutyens' New Delhi, and Dadabhai Nauroji Selected Private Papers. At the moment, he is turning his dissertation into a biography of Dadabhai Nauroji. Welcome to you, Dinyar. Next, we have Murali Ranganathan. He researches the 19th century with a special focus on Bombay and Western India. His current areas of interest include the Bombay country trade, industrial archaeology and history, print history and culture, photography, newspapers and periodicals, and public performance. His publications include Govind Narayan's Mumbai, an urban biography from 1863, which is a translation of the iconic Marathi urban biography Mumbaichi Varnan. He has edited and introduced the collected works of J.V. Nayak, Reform and Renaissance in 19th century Maharashtra. Welcome, Murali. Next, we have Vikram Doctor rather. He is the editor special features for the Economic Times, as well as one of India's most respected food writers, critics, and commentators. He is specialized in writing on food issues for the past 12 years and writes a column called On My Plate for the Economic Times. Please welcome Vikram. Finally, moderating our session, we have Simeen Patel. Simeen runs Bombaywala, a platform that creates awareness about Bombay's built environment and social history. Bombaywala operates a blog and conducts historical walks of the city's localities and celebrated structures. Simeen completed her PhD in modern South Asian history from Balliol College, University of Oxford in 2015. Welcome, Simeen, and over to you.
So firstly, thank you for making it in the midst of the Maratha Morcha. We hope we can include the Morcha into our discussion by looking at the ways regional parties are using Bombay's founding Sethyas as part of their political discourse and heritage. But let's start with the first urban biography of Bombay, Mumbai Chevarnan, which was published in 1863. It was written by Govind Narayan, a teacher, a scholar, and a writer who had migrated from Goa to Bombay in the 1820s as a young boy. Now, Mumbai Chevarnan is a fascinating look at our early city before the fort walls had been demolished and a new urban center had been created. And Govind Narayan's enthusiasm, optimism, which is infectious for the city, also extends to his optimism about wealth and philanthropy and the city's elites. So understanding Narayan's take is a good way of placing why business families did well in the city, because there was a general optimism about the city and about wealth and about the elites. Murli has translated Mumbai Chevarnan from Marathi to English in a very well-received book that was published by Anthem Press. And Murli, why don't we show them both? Here we go. And so I'd like to start by asking you about what was Narayan's take on the city, and particularly the city's elite and business families and wealth and philanthropy.
Can I start from the start?
Sure.
By sort of reading out Govind Narayan's earliest document, which he sort of reproduces. He produces many documents, and I'll read out just one poem. And bear with me if I read it out in full. It'll take you about a couple of minutes, and it's in a language which I think all of us can understand. So I'll try and do that. And it really answers your question almost to a T. This poem is from the 1790s. 1790s was literally the first decade when Bombay came to be recognized as a global city. I mean, its trade had grown in the previous few decades, literally from the 1750s, and by 1790s it had displaced almost all the ports on the western coast of India, and it had become the premier port of the country, of the British ruling part of it, which is effectively practically the entire country. And this poem is by a poet called Malhari, who was in the court service of Madhara of India, who was the viceroy, so to speak, of India in 1792. The Mughal emperor was under his control, so to speak, and he was the ruler of India effectively for at least a few months, if not a couple of years. And after he died in the early 1790s, Malhari came back to Bombay, came back to his town, Junnar, and perhaps he touched Bombay on his way back home. And when he saw Bombay, he must have been shocked, shocked, surprised, and impressed. And this is what came out of that. This poem is from the original Govind Narayan's book. It's called an Urdu Lavani, and it's Urdu and Lavani together. That's an Urdu Lavani, and I shall try and read it out for you. आसपास दरिया भरा है बड़ा जी ख्याल कुदरत का, विलायत में बादशाह रहना मुल्कों पर अमल उनका, तालेचारी मद्रास वहाँ है कलकत्ता बंगाले का, बड़े बड़े शहरों में तारीफ नाम बजाता मुंबई का, पानी पर फौजा लगाया चार तरफ गोशा उनका, सब शहरों पर हुक्म चलाता बंगाले का साहिब का, मुंबई शहर का नवा बंदर माल आवता मुल्कों का, काशी गया अब भया बालक टोपी वाले का, सूरत में साहिबी करते शहर बढ़ाया कोची का, माहिम मांडवी धक्का बंदर नादर सुभावना, कर्नाटक मस्कत चीन बड़ा माल आवता भरना, मुंबई शहर गुलजार मुंबा देवी है ठिकाना. So the refrain of this poem is Mumbai Shahar Gulzar, which effectively basically means here is the most prosperous city of Bombay. इंग्रेज की साहिबी चलता ऊपर किला नमूना, अजब तरह का टापू मुंबई जड़ा है दक्खन में, शिव शंकर पैगंबर देव रहते हैं ते बस्ती में, उस बस्ती के चातुर लोग ऐसा नहीं कोई दुनिया में, पवन से लेता काम लकड़ी चलाता है पानी में, सैकड़ों खंडी का आटा होता है पवन चक्की में, पलटन को पाव बनाकर भिजवा देता लश्कर में, सुनो घड़ियाली घनन घनन आवाज़ आता देवल में, क्या कलसूत्र काम बनाया घंटा बाजे देवल में, बावड़ी को बम बांधकर पानी भिजवाता जहाज़ों में, हज़ारों आरमार खड़ी देखत तमाशा बंदर में, कांटे से तोहफा चढ़ाकर उतार लेते किले में, पहाड़ सरी के जहाज़ बनाते कारखाना गोदी में, 100 हत्ती से काम न होवे सो एक आदमी ने करना, उसमें से जहाज निकाल कर बड़े पानी में ले जाना, मुंबई शहर गुलजार मुंबा देवी है ठिकाना. I presume all of you could understand most of the words and the general point he's making, and if Simin permits, I'll go ahead. क्या हिकमत से संगीन पक्का काम बनाया है किले का, कोट के अंदर कोट घेरा खंदक पानी का, बुरुज पर तोहफा रखा है बड़ा मार मारने का, खड़ा चौकी पहारा होता है बंदोबस्ती दरवाजे का, कोट के अंदर कोट खासा किला साहेब का, सवाई निशान भड़के बावटा विलायत के बादशाह का, कोट के बाजू न्यारा मुकाम है कुलाबे का, दांडी पर चिराग जलता सुमार मनवर आने का, उस बाजू को और किला बांधा है टेकड़ी का, सब शहर को लिया पेट में वांकू सकता नहीं चलने का, परेल में हवेली बना हुआ है ऐसा काम नहीं देखा, माहिम से लगा मुंबई बाग बंगले का खूब रमणा, जग्गो जग्गे मेला होता है महालक्ष्मी देखना, मुंबई शहर गुलजार मुंबा देवी है ठिकाना. सेठ और सावकार घर घर अमल सबको खिलावते, पार्शियन गुजराती शेंडवी प्रभु चलावते, मुसलमान और सब लोग बड़े बड़े तालिबान वहाँ रहते, उनके जीव सब खोई ख्याल तमाशा देखत है, 12 कौंसिलदार 8वें दिन कौंसिल भरते हैं, बुक देखकर जुस्टिस होती साहेब करता अदलज से, नुक्ते से गोविंदराव जुन्नर रानोजी वहाँ रहते, प्रिय मूरत की दुआ देखकर मल्लारी ख्याल खूब गाते, मुंबा देवी माता शर्म रखना तेरे बिन कुछ नहीं रहते, भैरू बजाते मोर छंग दंग आबाजी छंद खूब गाते, छोटे बड़े सब लोगों की अर्जी मेरी सुन लेना, हम परदेस पाखरू उस खातर मोहब्बत रखना, मुंबई शहर गुलजार मुंबा देवी है ठिकाना. That's the poem, and it sort of summarizes the entire growth of Bombay until the 1790s. You can see the geography of Bombay is sort of covered. The fort has been described in fairly big detail, and he talks about the huge amount of trade and the shipping lines, as well as the dry docks where the ships are being constructed, plus the Parsis, Gujaratis, Musalmans, Shenvis, Prabhus. These are the main communities which were in Bombay in the 1790s, and these were communities about which hopefully we'll talk about all of them as we go along. Thank you.
Dinyar, into this setting, could you tell us about the families you have been researching, particularly the ones that are not as celebrated but deserve a lot more attention?
Sure. So, well, first of all, I want to thank Asad and everyone at Avid for putting this together. So, my research, which is currently going on, at least in terms of me trying to turn my dissertation into a book, has looked a lot at early Indian nationalism, specifically at Dadabhai Nauroji, and through that lens, you kind of open up lots of different avenues into exploring who precisely was important in early Bombay in, say, the 1850s, 1860s, not really early, but maybe later on in perspective of what the poem that Murli had written out. So one way which I have been able to research Bombay is through the growth of educational infrastructure in the city. So, a lot of you know that Elphinstone College was really the first big institute of higher learning that was set up in Western India by the British. Similarly, a lot of schools were set up throughout Bombay city and throughout the then Bombay presidency, where English language courses were given. Oftentimes British people would teach. What is less known is that a lot of the work that was put in for building these schools, funding them, providing the textbooks, and even setting up courses and curricula was actually done by Indians. And in this case, a lot of the Shettiya elite, the merchant elite of Bombay, played quite a significant role. So even if you look as far back as the 1820s, when you have the beginning of organizations like the Bombay Native Educational Society, which was in charge of setting up these schools, you have, an roughly equal number of Britons and Indians who are members of the board that kind of funds these schools and makes sure that they function well. And you get a good idea of who was whom. I mean, if you look, for example, at around the late 1820s, 1830s, people who are on the board include people who we might not necessarily know much about today. People like Muhammad Ali Roge, Dhakchi Dadaji, who was a Maharashtrian trader, eventually people like Jagannath Shankar Sheth, and perhaps better known individuals like Jamshedji Jijiboy got on later on. But these individuals sat side by side with Britons, and they made sure that at least an increasing number of Indians in Bombay were able to get free or relatively free education at these schools, and were eventually taught subjects such as chemistry, physics, mathematics, the English language. So, we have a few anecdotal examples of what would go on in these schools. I know, for example, that Dadabhai Naoroji, when he was very young, was made to kind of put on a Roman toga and was meant to act in a play as a Roman senator opposite Cato. Another Indian was dressed up as Cato. In another instance, Naoroji was told to stand on top of a table. He must have been no more than 9 or 10, where he had to perform as Canute the Great. Canute was an Anglo-Saxon king. I forget his exact dates, but around the medieval era in England. And so here you have an Indian whose family was from rural Gujarat just a generation before, and now he's standing up on a table and acting like an Anglo-Saxon king. It's kind of wacky and kind of strange. But a lot of Indians were very, very important in making sure that this whole dynamic developed. I mean, an important thing we have to remember is that the British might have introduced Western education, they might have introduced a few certain reforms, but Indians played a huge role in taking the initiative and making sure that certain ideas were put into practice. And in this case, Bombay Shetiyas were very important in this process. So if we go a little bit further on to say the late 1840s, 1850s, when the first kind of generations of graduates from Elphinstone College had emerged, we start to see in around 1848-49 these Elphinstone College graduates talk about the need for setting up girls' schools. Now at this time, Indians did not have a very good track record of educating women, so there were some examples. I mean, Jagannath Shankar Sheth, for example, educated his daughters, but by and large, most women were not educated. I mean, most Indian men of a relatively medieval mindset would not really let them out of the house that much. I mean, it's a very different world. But these individuals at Elphinstone College decide to set up some girls' schools. They did not have much money. They had the time, they had the interest, they had the zeal to do this. But the people who stepped in and provided the money were many of these Shetiyas. So again, people like Jagannath Shankar Sheth, who set up a girls' school on his own property. So where he lived, he actually gave a building and said, here's a schoolhouse. Other people from the Kama family, the Kama Parsi family, stepped in. A lot of times you will see that topics like reforms like education caused a lot of internal schisms and rifts. So the Kama family at that point in time was a relatively conservative family. And most of them did not support the idea of female education. But one member did, a man called Karshidji Nasaranji Kama. If you see a picture of him, he had a nice long flowing beard and a turban. He didn't really speak English that well. He had no formal education. But when people who were graduates from Elphinstone came and approached him and said, we want to start girls' schools, he said, that sounds like a good idea. Why doesn't half of humanity get the opportunities that men have? So he actually donated a large amount of money, not just for establishing girls' schools, but for setting up prizes for essays. So, for example, if you were a child, either a girl or a boy in school at this point in this point in time, you could be given an essay competition to write about the importance of smallpox inoculations, or the importance of knowing that astrology was bunk. Kama would give you money if you won a prize for these essays. So these people, again, played a very important role in kind of encouraging and pushing these educative ventures onward. I've probably talked for too long, so I'll stop talking right now.
Just a little bit. The girls' prizes were also watches very often. And Narayan talks a lot about how many watches, how many clocks and watches there were, and how many companies and repair companies there were in Bombay. So, just to say that girls also got watches. Vikram?
I want to make slightly counterpoint to what Murli said. I mean, it's a slightly counterintuitive point. I mean, when Govind Narayan is writing about Mumbai, he's writing as a promoter of Mumbai. So one has to keep that in mind. He's full of enthusiasm. The city is great. But I think most historians would argue that, Bombay was not actually that important in the larger scheme of things until the mid-19th century. I mean, Calcutta was clearly the center of imperial, of British India. That was where the viceroy was. Madras was probably as equally as important as Bombay. And this, in a way, probably helped the subject of this evening, because I think this point has been made by people like Lord Markowitz, that the divisions between the British and the Indians were not as wide in Bombay as they were definitely in Calcutta, where there was this whole imperial hierarchy. There was the governor general on top, then the whole bureaucracy below. And Indians, while the people like the Tagores and all that were important, but very clearly there was a clear distinction. So the point that's been made is that in Bombay, the divisions between the Indians and the British, while they were clearly there, I mean, nobody was saying that everybody was that close, were not as wide. The second point being that this, I think, the Markowitz makes the points when he's he with a lot of figures, is that most of the British who were dominating trade in Calcutta were sending their money back to the United Kingdom, whereas in Bombay the bulk of the money was being made by native traders who were investing it back in the city, in the physical infrastructure of the city. And just two other quick points. I mean, one, I think, since we're talking about building the city, I think the geography of Bombay may also have helped. And here I'm really contrasting it with Madras, which is where I grew up. The sheer compact nature of Bombay meant that people had to rub up against each other. I mean, what you get from the descriptions in Govind Narayan's Bombay is this huge crowd of people, shoving up against each other, exactly what we see today. And you can't escape people in Bombay. Whereas, compare that to Madras, which is a much more wider, spread out city. The different communities were very separate. The British obviously completely separate, but even the Indian communities, the Tamil Brahmins near Mylapore, the Telugus near what is now Tinagar, the Gujaratis who came later near Saidapet, etc. The city did not, rub up against each other in a way. So, but whereas in Bombay you couldn't avoid it, and I think this is one thing that really helped, people, invest in Bombay. And the last point, and this is where I think Dinyar would have something interesting to say, is about the sort of in-between role of the Parsis. Because, what you get with the Parsis, and not just the Parsis, also the Armenians and the Jews and other communities, is the idea of themselves as not Indian, not British, as sort of intermediaries. And as such, able to take leaps that Indians would not have been able to take. And this, I think, really helps a lot in setting up institutions. I mean, I don't know, Dinyar, what do you feel about this?
So yes, I mean a lot of scholars will talk about the Parsis as being intermediaries, which is true to an extent. I actually kind of disagree with that to a certain degree. I mean, if you read what Indians were actually, what Parsis were actually writing to one another, it's very clear that they were seeing themselves as Indians and identifying fully with the interests of their fellow Indian community members. By having a relative monopoly on education through at least the early 1900s, they were by that nature set apart. I mean, the Parsis were incredibly literate by Indian standards in comparison with other communities, so therefore they could kind of do a little bit more. They could talk to British officials. They could wear, the funny clothes that the British wore and all that good stuff. But I kind of disagree, at least with that role of the Parsis being fully intermediary. I mean, again, if you look at a figure like Behramji Malbari, some of you might be familiar with who he was. He was a poet in the late 1800s, but also a very important social reformer. So the age of consent law, which really inflamed Tilak in the 1890s, was Behramji Malbari's brainchild. Malbari has been described as an ultimate intermediary. But again, if you read his actual letters, he's very pro-Congress. He is talking about working with other Indian communities, and he's not describing himself as an intermediary. He's describing himself as someone who is very much against, the particular brand of British imperialism that's at work in the 1890s and 1890s, and there's a clear language of us versus them. I'll be a good academic and say I agree with you partially and partially not also.
Let me qualify what I said. I agree with you, obviously, and there is a certain bias that has come into this idea of Parsis as intermediaries, because it was created to some extent by English-speaking Parsis who had an interest in describing themselves as an elite, and we forget that there is a vast amount of Parsi writing in Gujarati that just does not get translated or commented on. So you're right, but I'm saying that the fact that the Parsis, from fairly early on abandoned Pardab largely, that they didn't have the sort of restrictions on food taboos and things like that, made them open to consumption. And I'll give you an example, and I'm just looking at the reference right here in Govind Narayan's Bombay, from something that I write about, which is ice. Okay, and ice in Bombay has this really fascinating history because it comes with the Americans, with Frederick Tudor on these ships, and it's this amazing story about how he sends them from New England, from Walden actually, Walden Pond, and it comes to Bombay, and the people in Bombay cannot imagine it. Oh my God, there's ice in Bombay. You have to imagine a city with no air conditioning, just pankas, just nothing, and like in the middle of humid thing like that. And so when the first ship's ice comes to Bombay, there's this huge excitement. And this is all reported in the Times of India. There are all these debates about, oh my God, they raise these donations to give an award to the captain of the ship and thanks to him for coming. And the first thing they all do is they set up a committee to build an ice house. So they're actually creating a sort of thing where the ice can stay because they want to encourage him to come back. And the ice house is now where the K.R. Kama Institute is now. But Govindarajan says something interesting in this book. I mean, he says that Hindus don't eat ice. That it's of the Parsis and also the Muslims to some extent who eat ice. And you also see this in the discussions because initially it's just British who are talking about contributing towards building the ice house. But then one or two Parsis come forth and give these generous donations, and you can see a certain level of negotiation over there. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm not trying to say that the Parsis were not Indian or trying to sing, but they were able to consume and help build institutions in a certain way.
Can I just supplement this? I mean, I think he's also right, and you're also right in terms of the points you make. but the role of the Parsis was clearly evolving from say 1800 when they really became prominent. So very few of them became prominent to the say 1920s when they started the anti-Gandhi movement, so to speak, in Bombay and so on and so forth. I mean, you have somebody like as prominent as Jamshedji Jiji Boy, whom I think everybody here knows, even though he's dead for 150 years. Unlike many of the other Sethiyas we'll be talking about, we still know if we talk about JJ Flyover, JJ Hospital and JJ School of Art and those kind of things. And here is this man getting his knighthood in 1842, and he's receiving the knighthood with one hand, and in his private letters he's criticizing the British to the members of parliament. I mean, he's talking about the kind of policies of the East India Company with such vehemence. I mean, there could be no two ways about what he thought about the British policies towards India, towards the poor people, towards the introduction of taxes on the poorest people and so on. All of this is available in the building next door in the University of Bombay. And he's writing to the MPs of the British Parliament and telling them that this is just absolutely unfair, absolutely, nefarious, to use the word, and just absolutely cannot be done by a parliament. And these are all strangers. These are not friends like Charles Forbes, who was, there's a Forbes Road just down the road here, who was a very close friend of Jamshedji, and he writes to him really with no reservations at all, but he even writes to strangers and with great vehemence. At the same time, he's getting the knighthood. He's calling himself Sir Jamshedji Jiji Boy very proudly. He's meeting the governors, and he's setting up hospitals, and the Grand Medical College is also named after the governor of that time when it was conceived. So you can see that there is a fair bit of, to call them intermediaries in the comprador style would be pretty much unfair, like some people have done. But I think by the time that's 1920s, there's a huge section of Parsis who are really, as British as the British can get, if not more. You have people like JRB Jiji Boy complaining about being, racially discriminated against in the ships, when they go abroad, and so on and so forth. So, they thought of themselves as British as anybody else. So there is a big change as we go along from the mid 1800s to the early 1900s. There is a certain amount of change, and you have Parsis. Of course, you have Parsis like Dadabhai Nauroji and Firozshah Mehta, who led the freedom struggle, so to speak, in the early part of the Congress's career. But then you had many others who sort of moved to the other side, and you had people from the Parsis thinking about going back to Iran. As fanciful as that. They just didn't want to stay in an independent India ruled by Indians.
I'll give you back the control of the discussion in 5 minutes. But I just want to make this point about the knighthood is actually very interesting. And by the way, about the Parsis, I mean, we have to credit the Parsis with not abandoning Bombay like let's say, like the Sassoons did, for example. I mean, the Parsi entrepreneurs may have cribbed about the Congress, but they got down to it and they stayed, and they stayed in India by and large, and helped build the cities. Not unlike the Sassoons who were out of here as soon as like independence became a real possibility. The knighthood is interesting. I've been reading this really amazing book, Preeti Chopra's A Joint Enterprise, Indian Elites and the Making of British Bombay. It's recently been published over here. It's an absolutely fascinating book, which very much the subject of today's discussion. She makes one small throwaway point about the way one of the basic points she makes in this book is how the British encouraged private participation in building the city, in building the institutions of the city. And one point that she makes, which I thought was very nice, was that they had a very easy, it didn't cost them anything, tool. They gave out knighthoods, basically. So people like Kawasi Jahangir, Jamshedji Jiribo, all had this dangling sort of thing that, you invest enough money, you'll get a knighthood. If you invest even more, you'll become a baronet. I don't think anybody became a lord. I think there are only Calcutta lords in her. But so this was, and I really feel that while at some level knighthoods and this whole thing are really ridiculous, maybe we missed a trick by dumping it post-independence. It's an easy way for a government.
You have a Padma Bhushan, you have Padma Bhushans now.
Padma Bhushans, you don't count. You can't call themselves. Like in Malaysia, for instance, they've retained it in a certain way, and you have a whole system of tuns and this thing, etc., where you can continue. So one has to show how, acknowledge how smart the British were to, using this sort of...
I think we are being a little bit unfair on Jamshedji Jijiboy here, because he was the first knight of India, and I don't think he had really any idea whatsoever when the first knighthood came that he would be getting it. So I think at least for that one thing we can, but the second one where he became a baronet, the amount of strings the family pulled, they went all the way up to the queen and so on. So by which time he had wisened up that, it works both ways. But the knighthood was really just a compliment.
All the petits and ready money,
right.
Were clearly playing the game. So, sorry. Dinyana wanted to disagree with us.
Murni, wanted to ask you about the Rogais who you've been researching recently. Basically, the most prominent Konkani Muslim family in the 19th century who also built the Jamma Masjid. Can you tell us a little more about them?
I'm not on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever is there, and Simin is. And obviously, most of you know much more about Simin than me. Ditto for Jamshedji and Roge. Jamshedji was the kind of person who would go around asking people to write articles about him. If not that, he would get, if they didn't do that, he would get biographies published anonymously in the UK. And anyway, he would start networking with all sorts of powerful people. And then you have Roge, who was his business partner. Perhaps they sat in the same room from 1818 to 1850, when they were officially equal partners, or if not equal, at least significant partners in Jamshedji Jijiboy and Company, the biggest Indian firm in the first half of the 19th century. So you had Roge, you had Jamshedji. And Roge, after he died, he just vanished from public history. There are literally 1,000 books on Bombay, and if any of them ever mentioned Roge, it's just one footnote or just one line. Though this man lived for a good 75 years, from 1775 to 1850, he was a partner in the biggest business firm of Jijiboy, and he Society as well, and of numerous other public organizations and public forums. And in spite of that, after he died, somebody sort of coined, in the traditional Persian practice, you have chronograms, Kata Tariq-e-Wafat, which basically sort of gives you a mnemonic for remembering the year in which you died, the Hijri year. In this case, 1850 was 1266. So some I don't know whether it was a sarcastic thing or whatever. 1266 worked out to Gul Hua Chirag. Gul Hua Chirag is basically the lamp is extinguished. So the minute he died, after that we just forgot about him. And so I've been trying to, I've been looking at Gigi Boy's career, and if you look at Gigi Boy's career, it's basically Gigi Boy and Roge's career. Whatever they did for the last, from the 1820s to the 1850s was basically together. So they owned the ships together, they sent their opium chests together, they traded in cotton together, and so on and so forth. So I've been trying to excavate stuff about Roge. And you do find lots of public monuments. I mean, if you just walk down this road all the way up to CST, you have the Anjuman-e-Islam. So there's a small plaque there which says part of this land was given in lieu of the Nakhuda Talab, which was near Dhobi Talab. Nakhuda was the honorific of Muhammad Ali Roge, and he had built one talab for the public of Bombay near Dhobi Talab, which is near the Framji Kawasji Institute or Metro Cinema these days. And if you go further down from there, opposite the JJ School of Art, if you go a little into the Lower Chal area, you have the Jama Masjid, which of course is an old entity, but he was the one who sort of got it to the present shape, which was in 1838. And if you see photographs from the mid 19th century and now, it's pretty much still the same. It's the same kind of architecture. It's still preserved. So Roge is around, and I also managed to track down his tombstone in Marine Lines, the Bada Kabristan. There is a Roge compound there, and you find his tombstone, which is with the rest of his family. And here you have a man who was pretty much in the topmost echelons of business, of business. I mean, you would call him whatever, maybe one of the lesser Ambani, so to speak. If not Mukesh, then at least Anil. I mean, that was his status. And then you find that after 150 years, he's gone from history. His brother was also an equally big trader, Muhammad Syed Roge, and you have absolutely no mention of this gentleman. All we can now look at the very early Urdu books from the 1840s. The Urdu printing and publishing started in Bombay, in Western India in the 1840s, where Muslims got involved with book publishing. And there you find that many of the books were patronized by Muhammad Ali Roge, and he funded the printing of these books, and perhaps he just like his friend Jamshedji, who also printed books and got them distributed for free, Roge also might have done those kind of things. So you find that in spite of having similar trajectories of life, there are lots of businessmen in Bombay who have still left the mark. If you go around looking for them, you will get them, but who just are not part of many of the mainstream narratives. Can I just go a little step further? Having talked about a Musalman, I would also like to talk about Motichand Amichand, who also was a contemporary of Jamshedji. He died in 1836, and I think at his death he was bigger than Jamshedji. Jamshedji was by far one of the richest men in Bombay in terms of business family and business and trade. And Motichand would have given him a run for his money any day. And he was the biggest, one of the most influential traders who had a very strong control over the supply chain of opium from Malwa to Bombay via Daman or via Karachi. So he would have his ships practically in every port, and he was one of the biggest traders. And now Motichand Amichand is even, you can't even get vague portraits. Simeon was asking me if you have any portraits or anything at all. There was no photography, obviously, when these people were around. So there's really nothing available in terms of portraits or whatever. But again, just like you have this mosque in South Bombay here, you can also find that Motichand also funded the building of a derasa. Baikhala in those days was literally back of beyond. And you find many of these setiyas going beyond what the city was of Bombay, and you have many of these setiyas going beyond the city limits to buy land and build their monuments, build the places of worship. So you have, what is the Love Lane? Now it is called the Motichand Amichand Road, but it was earlier called the Love Lane, and I think it's still known by that more popularly. And that's where you have the derasa. And he also built one in Paidhoni also, but the bigger one which he just built just before he died is in Baikhala. And so you have places of worship being sort of, that's the only reminder of these people having existed, so to speak, in the business pantheon. And almost all of the records are all gone. I mean, luckily for Jamshedji, we got a few volumes of original records preserved, but for almost all of the business families of Bombay, almost nothing is available, both European and Indian. I mean, there were a lot of European families who are also equally active in Bombay, Forbes, for example, and many others, but nothing is really available about them.
Okay, now slightly move on to our next section. So historians have commented that national associations and a national consciousness came to Bombay relatively late as compared to Calcutta and Pune, where national associations were developing very quickly by the 1870s. So could you tell us a little about early nationalism in Bombay and which were the Sethia families that were involved with it and what were the dynamics? Was it fraught or was it...
Sure, and I'll try not to talk for too long because that's basically my dissertation. But before I get to that, let me just very, very quickly mention on the last thing that Murli mentioned, just the absence of sources about most people. Public service announcement. If any of you have or know of letters, old newspapers, do not throw them away, please, for God's sake. Okay, especially if you're Parsi, because most Parsis, for some reason have thrown away lots of stuff. But please make sure it's kept properly. If we could magically go back 40 years in time to the 1970s, we'd be able to write so much better of a history of Bombay than we could now. Because since then, a lot of stuff has turned into literally dust or termite droppings. So please make sure to preserve your material. Moving on to what Simon asked me to actually talk about right now. In 1852, the first real political organization for Indians was founded, something called the Bombay Association. And once more, you had Shetiyas involved in setting up this association. The president was Jagannath Shankar Sheth. You had Jamshedji Jijibai involved in it also. But the association was by and large a flop. It worked for a few years, but there were severe fissures that developed between the Shetya leadership and again this group of kind of like young Turks who emerged from Elphinstone College and who wanted to do things at a much more rapid or radical nature. So, if originally, the association was set up in order to send a petition to the Parliament to talk about whether or not the East India Company's charter should be renewed. Back in this era, every few decades, the East India Charter was renewed, and so Indians took this opportunity to kind of send all their complaints to Parliament about what the East India Company was doing to Indians. So people like Baudaji Lard or Navroji Fardunji wrote relatively scathing comments about what the East India Company was doing, and they put this in their petition. The Shetiyas were not very comfortable with this because ultimately they also knew that their business depended by and large on a degree of rapport between them and British officials in charge. So they kind of backed away. And from that point onward, until from the 1850s all the way up until the very early 1880s or so, the Bombay Association sometimes was on, sometimes was off. It was other people were doing more stuff in places like Madras or Calcutta, and Bombay was kind of caught behind, especially in comparison with Pune. The Pune Sarvjanik Sabha was doing a lot, and it was light years ahead of Bombay certainly at this era. Nevertheless, something changed. By the early 1880s, and definitely by the year 1884, 1885, when talk is begun about setting up something that eventually becomes the Indian National Congress, Bombay becomes central to this project. I mean, Alan Octavian Hume, who's the founder of the Indian National Congress, came specifically to Bombay to talk to people. They met at the bungalow of a person called William Wordsworth, who had a bungalow, I think, by Breach Candy. William Wordsworth, not the poet, his grandson, who actually taught at Elphinstone College. So they met at this person's bungalow in Breach Candy, and you had all the major, future nationalist leaders assembled over here. You had people like Ranade, you had people like Nauroji, you had others like Behramji Malbari, and others included also. So at this point in time, when the Congress is set up, Shetiyas were also included. Dinsha Petit, who recently had become Sir Dinsha Petit, was involved in the early Congress, but once again these people back out when politics get a little bit too radical for their tastes. So Petit, by the 1887, 1888, had turned around and said, no, you guys are doing way too much. You're being critical of the British. The Viceroy now doesn't like us. The Viceroy was a man called Lord Dufferin, who first said, he supported the Congress and then said, no, absolutely, I do not support them. So people like Pittit kind of backed away. Some of the early nationalists looked amongst themselves and said, what do we do? And the answer was, oftentimes, in order to look for financial support and patronization, to look at either smaller business officials or people who are not already, part of this group of big Bombay merchants who had established some degree of rapport with British officials and British trading firms. So when Pittit said, I'm not giving you much money, we have a letter that's written by Behramji Malbari to a few other people like Dincha Vacha and Dadabai Naroji saying, look, I'm trying to get these Parsi Shetiyas to contribute, they're just not doing anything, what do I do? Furthermore, he tried to get people in what he classified as the Mufassal. Mufassal at the time meant Pune. So don't tell your friends at Pune that, but Mufassal was that at that point in time. And he said similarly, if he talked to Parsis, these Parsis were being even more intransigent and were saying, why should we deal with something like the Congress? It's something that only helps Hindus and Muslims. What does this have to do with us? So they turned to lesser known individuals in Bombay, people like Fazul Bhai Visra, who was a important member of not just the Muslim community, but a member of the Bombay Municipal Corporation and a trader. Other people like Rahimtullah Sayani, who was a lawyer. And these people ended up supporting them to a large degree. I'll stop soon. But I mean, this dynamic at least of commercial figures or Setiyas giving some support and then withdrawing it occasionally continued all the way through the Gandhian era. The Tatas were supportive of Gandhi at certain stages, and then they were not. The Godrejes were supportive of Gandhi at a certain stage and then backed away a little bit. And this went back and forth, all the way up until independence.
And I think one should recognize that, why this back and forth thing was happening to some extent, partly because of the growth of Swadeshi industry in Western India. So to some extent, the Congress program, especially once Gandhi started advocating Swadeshi, sort of chimed with the Congress. Of course, at some point Gandhi gets angry with the industrialists because he feels they're profiting, that they're not promoting khadi in the sense they're promoting in things. But to some extent, they could see a commonality. And I think there's a lovely anecdote that Ritu Birla has discovered in her work on the Marwaris, which I think shows how the local Seths were like playing everything like carefully, because she was studying the account books, the khatas, and she found this whole system of what she called dharmada khatas, where they would give charity donations. So it was common, for instance, to adopt a temple, and you would have an account book for the temple, which every month a certain amount would go. So in one of the families, I think not in Bombay, I think this was in Nagpur that she was studying, she found three interesting account books. One is Sri Ram Ka Dharmada Khata, so the money was going to the big Ram temple in Nagpur. Then Sri Hanuman Ka Dharmada Khata, which it was going to the family Hanuman temple. And the third book was Sri Congress Ka Dharmada Khata. So the money was also going to the Sri Congress. Just be careful.
Okay, so that really brings us to Gandhi. And when Gandhi first took his family to South Africa, he decided to dress them in Parsi style, because he said Parsis used to be regarded as the most civilized people amongst Indians, which is also your point about intermediaries, that in many ways they were exemplars for many other communities, and dress was a big way in which they were intermediaries, because you have a national sort of movement to dress civilized, and that civilized meant dressing like Parsis. But when Gandhi comes back from South Africa, he's back in his Kathiawadi dress, and he goes to a grand reception at the house of the Pittit family, Mount Pittit, and he was totally uncomfortable with the pomp and the grandeur of Pittit mansion. So I was wondering, really, is it that with the coming of Gandhi that kind of Setya hospitality dies out, and it's the end of the Setyas is the coming of Gandhi, and Gandhi in turn is drawn to other Gujarati and Marwadi communities that in their material lives are much more sober and ascetic as compared to these, fairly grand Setyas. So is Gandhi changing everything?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think Gandhi did come from a business from a business community. Well, his family was more in the service of the sort of Rajas of Saurashtra. But he did come, and there was an instinctive understanding, much more so than you get with someone like Nehru for himself, and a certain level of comfort with business communities, which was continued right pretty much through, and that's why he becomes extremely close to people like the Sarabhais, even at a point of time when what he's advocating goes directly against the Sarabhai interests. There's still enough commonality and feeling that the Sarabhais continue supporting him. So I mean, clearly there were some communities, and I said, one should not just talk about the Parsis. I would say one forgets people like the Sassoons. The Sassoons have been forgotten from Bombay, except for the David Sassoon, next to us. But the Sassoons were a hugely powerful community in Bombay, and completely opposed in many ways to Indian nationalism, to the extent that they left. I mean, so one shouldn't just attack the few rich Parsi families who had mixed feelings about the Congress. So I think it goes both ways. I think one also forgets that there was a third community, a third sort of group whose influence in Western India was interesting, and I don't think it's been written enough about, and that was the Rajas, the princely states. Because the princely states and the influence is something that has been largely forgotten in India, except we think of them in terms of luxury and heritage hotels and things like that. But the princely states were very varied, and many of them were completely dissolute and not interested in investing, but many of them were, and for some reason, quite a few of them in Western India. Kolhapur, Baroda, of course, where Dadabhai Naoroji has an interesting interaction. And these princely states, I don't think enough has been written, and I think there's a very interesting work to be done on their role, both with nationalism and also in the building of Bombay. Because, once Bombay starts being built, I mean, various princes take large properties. I mean, the Vankaner Palace is just down the road. Hyderabad had a huge property on Malabar Hill. So there were, Lincoln House, I think, was owned by, I've forgotten, Bhavnagar or, one of them. So the princes invest in Bombay. I think one forgets a lot of the sort of Marine Drive mansions houses were originally owned by the princes, and the princes play interesting roles. I mean, some of them, like Baroda, definitely invest in industry. Many of them sponsor education, which is very interesting. I mean, Ambedkar was sponsored by the Maharaja of Baroda. You mentioned Pune, and I'm glad you did. The interest in Pune. This American historian called Ross Bassett has done this fascinating work on how Pune was a place which sent a lot of young Indians to the US, to MIT, to become engineers. And the sponsorship for this very often came from the Maharajas. Prabhashankar Patni, in particular, being a Diwan, who was a Diwan, who sponsored a lot of the early graduates who went to the US and then came back to invest. So I think there are these sort of complicated figures, but the figures of the Maharajas, I think, are quite interesting and not researched enough. I don't know, Dinesh, if that's come out in your work.
Can I just compliment this? I mean, I haven't really looked at it, but just trade references. I mean, if you find that the Bombay country trade, the princes, especially the Gujarat princes, who were actually the source of cotton, I mean, they also wanted a slice of the... And opium, of course. I mean, yeah. But so they would also invest in ships, and they would request some of the Bombay Sethias to manage the ship, and to manage the ship as in to actually run the ship for them on the behalf, and also perhaps manage the cargo also which they were sending. So you had close links in that sense, and you find somebody like Jamshedji, who was actually sometimes a mentor to many of these Rajas. I mean, for example, the Raja of Satara, who was finally deposed in 1839. I mean, the number of letters which Jamshedji writes to all sorts of real bigwigs all over London and in Scotland to support him and to support his his friend, the governor, James Revett Karnak, was trying to get him deposed, and he's trying to sort of balance both of them and say, I mean, let's try and get this going. And same with Janjira, when the Nawab of Janjira died, and the British wanted to sort of use the doctrine of lapse there. Jamshedji sort of sort of literally pleads the case with the British Parliament. He sends lawyers, he does all sorts of things for them. So there is a lot of interaction between, and the reason why I'm mentioning Jamshedji is because his papers survive. And that's nothing more than that. I'm sure that many of the other Sethiyas, especially because a lot of the Bombay Sethiyas, Hindu, Muslim, Jain, Parsi, were all from Gujarat. So
this is a completely fascinating area. This sort of interactions between the princely states, particularly in Western India, and the growth of Bombay. I mean, I'll just give you one more recent example. I mean, everyone's talking about Air India and Air India's crisis, and of course, everybody then remembers how J.R.D. Tata set up Air India. But one thing that's often forgotten is that the princes were actually quite important in the setting up of Air India, mainly because the British had no particular interest in developing commercial aviation in India. And it required a certain level of infrastructure. At the very basic level, you needed airstrips. So when JRD started trying to sell the idea of Indian airlines, and you see, planes could not fly very long at that time. You could only go short hops. So the people who invested in airstrips were all Maharajas. The Maharaja of Indore, for example. And so the first flights across for India were actually hopping flights between one princely state to another, because these were the ones who were setting up airstrips. And they were also his first customers, because for cargo. So, some of the first cargoes that Air India carried was stuff for the princely, like mangoes, for instance. They were sending mangoes, pan leaves, things like that. One forgets that this was Air India's first cargo, mangoes and pan leaves. But Dinesh, could you talk about Dadabhai Naoroji and his interaction, because I think that was a fascinating episode.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to expand it beyond just Naoroji himself. So I'm actually going to Baroda early tomorrow morning to go research a little bit on princely states. So I'll have more to say in about two or 3 days. But yeah, I mean, this talk is supposed to be on merchant princes. Princes are a good way to kind of jump a little bit on the side, but princes played a huge role, especially in the economy and political development in places like Bombay. To a degree, as Vikram said, that's been kind of forgotten and kind of elided by the fact that by 1947, people's impressions of princes were, these doddering figures who had lots of fortunes around them, limited political control, and some of them wanted to go their own way at the time of independence. It was very, very different in the late 1800s. You had members of the Congress saying that the hope of India lies with the princely domains. A very early argument that the nationalists tried to pioneer is that princely India was actually wealthier than British India. People actually compiled statistics in order to argue that if you were an Indian, you had greater likelihood to be richer, better educated, have access to better infrastructure and such if you were, say, a subject of the Gaekwad, or if you were a subject of some other princely state. And most of these princely states, as Vikram mentioned also, which were supportive of progressive ambitions on the part of the Congress or other organizations, were from Western India. So you had people like the Maharaja of Gondal, especially when Gondal was ruled by this man called Bhagwat Singhji. Yes, I mean, they still own the Royal Opera House. So, I mean, there still are Bombay connections today. These individuals were very supportive of political ambitions. I mean, there's a letter I discovered while looking through Naoroji's papers where Naoroji basically says, while he's running for parliament in Great Britain in 1892, I owe everything to you. I mean, he writes this to the Maharaja of Gondal because, obviously, we know England is a very expensive country. It was an expensive country back then, and if you want to run a parliamentary campaign, it's even more expensive, right? Where are you going to get the money? Oftentimes, the places where people got the money for stuff like this were the princes. So the Maharaja of Gondal gave, I think, 50,000 rupees, which at that point in time was, something that would make your mouth drop to the floor. And that helped Naoroji run through in his finances for running for parliament. So these people were very influential. I mean, Ranjit Singhji eventually from Jamnagar, other people like that also. And, there's a reason why these individuals would have houses in Bombay. Because, I mean, people were going back and forth between parts of Gujarat or other parts of Western India, merchants or people who were in the darbars of these princely states. So it was to their benefit to have some, one foot in their princely state and one foot in Bombay as well.
Just on the point of Dadabhai Naoroji, he dabbled in, he's squarely part of Bombay's intelligentsia as a category, but he also dabbled in business in London. So did Bombay's intelligentsia make good businessmen, or what were their, how was he as a businessman?
It's difficult to say, again, because a lot of the documents have been lost. In some documents show that he was an absolutely lousy businessman. He went bankrupt in the 1860s. Nauroji's problem was that in many cases he was too honest. Some of you know this. During the American Civil War, supplies of cotton to Great Britain, and Britain was the place that produced a lot of cotton goods, were cut, right? I mean, so the American South supplied cotton to Great Britain, but that door slammed shut when the American Civil War started. So India stepped into the breach and supplied cotton. Things were great. Bombay was going sky high, and then once 1865 comes along and the Civil War ends, huge recession, right? I mean, a lot of Bombay businessmen go belly up. Premchand, Roychand, and the others also. When this belly up phenomena happens, a lot of people come to Dadabhai Naoroji and say, can we borrow money from you? And Naoroji says, why, sure, of course. You seem like a trustworthy person. And there are letters that survive from the 1870s, say 10 years after this date, where Naoroji is saying, these people have still not paid me, I'm bankrupt. So he didn't always have very good acumen with business. There are some cases where he did. If you know a little bit about how the indigenous cotton manufacturing industry developed in Western India, you've probably heard of someone called Ranchhat Lal Chotalal from Ahmedabad. He set up the first cotton mill in Ahmedabad in, I think, 1859 or so, around that time. Where was Ranchhat Lal Chotalal getting all his equipment from? He got it from Nauroji. Nauroji at this point in time was in London. He had opened up a business in the city of London that dealt with machinery for cotton mills. And so Ranchhat Lal sent a letter to Nauroji and said, I need this and this material. Nauroji put it on a boat, and the boat was supposed to go off to India and provide Ranchhat Lal Chotalal with this first equipment that he would use to build up this cotton empire. Unfortunately, the boat sank. But that really was not Nauroji's doing, of course. But there were instances where Nauroji was very prescient and was able to kind of tap into these particular individuals who had potential. And there were instances also where Nauroji was not the most prescient of individuals, such as dealing with his friends who went bankrupt after the cotton depression of 1865.
Okay, and now if we move to Indian independence and partition exactly 70 years ago, you have new business communities coming into the city like the Sindhis, and so how were they operating, and were these existing firms in new settings, or were they starting from scratch in Bombay?
I think obviously there were many people who started from scratch, but I mean, one tends to forget that very few people at the time of partition realized it would be as total and irrevocable as it turned out to be. I mean, many people assumed that there would be a going back and forth, and in fact there was a lot of going back and forth. I mean, Salman Rushdie's family is a good example. I mean, he's born in Bombay, lives in Bombay as a child, but he only moves to Pakistan around the early 1960s, and there was still this sort of ships going back and forth between Karachi and Bombay. So Azim Premji is another example of a family who had both links in Pakistan and India. Ghulam Muhammad, who was a partner with Mahindra's, is another example where maybe they thought that there could be a sort of cross-country thing. People in the event that didn't work out. I mean, but I think yes, there definitely were companies that came here and assumed that they would be able to continue, but in the end ended up having to make their fortunes in Bombay.
Murli, you had some earlier Sindhi businessman connections with Bombay.
I think, since Karachi was literally the closest boat ride to Bombay, I think the Sindhis, both Hindus and the Muslimans, had fairly close connections to Bombay from much earlier. In fact, one of the routes from which opium would come to Bombay was to avoid British taxes would have been to sort of go from Malwa to Rajputana and then come down the Indus via to Karachi and then sort of get smuggled on from there on. So Karachi had fairly, and people like Moti Chand would have ships stationed in Karachi for that. And Karachi Bandar was not very, because in the 1840s it was still owned, the Sindh was still ruled by the Amir. So as far back as that, you had in Bombay and Sindh. And as the Parsi sort of, the lament goes that they moved on from business to education to law and so on. So there was this big vacuum in the sort of the trading circles, especially the opium trade, which sort of suddenly became a little bit too messy for them. So the Sindhis and the Marwadis moved into that, and you find that, I mean, for example, the Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce is got I mean, in the early 1900s has got a lot of Sindhis with Bombay connections sitting in Hong Kong and doing this kind of trade.
You know, I think one point one tends to forget is that Bombay was not just this physical location of Bombay. I mean, you know, the administrative extent of Bombay and the links changed, but in trading sense, Bombay could perhaps, is an argument to be made, be seen as Bombay, Karachi, and Aden, which is a place you have like a close connection with, and you know, you have these Parsis, Sindhis, Marwaris, all Gujaratis, all moving back and forth between these three points, all of which, for various different geographical reasons, are very rich trading ports.
And just to say, I mean, the fourth corner would have been Mombasa. I mean, Kenya and Mombasa. I mean, Zanzibar. So, I mean, they were all going there from the 1880s. They were already there. I mean, you have guidebooks written in Gujarati from the early 1900s on how to sort of navigate the African continent, so to speak.
Okay, moving to our last section, a little bit about philanthropy today, and basically, are business families gifting in the areas of culture rather than civic life? So, has there been a shift in the practices of philanthropy from the 1860s, 70s?
I mean, you know, this is difficult because, and again, it's something that gets confused when people talk about corporate social responsibility and what are the things doing. Clearly, we're not seeing the sort of really big institutions, though hospitals are still being built. I mean, you know, the Ambani Hospital and places like that. Schools also, to some extent, again, with Ambani schools. Of course, these are very elite institutions. Right. I mean, let's be honest. We're not seeing, you know, people investing in institutions for the mass public. And one could argue that this is because they see it as an extension of a sort of corporate brand and things like that. And also because they feel that, you know, now that's the government's job. As I said, what is interesting, you know, and this book brings it out, is the extent to which the British in Bombay encouraged the private sector to contribute and invest in Bombay. And partly that's because the British didn't want to invest in Bombay themselves. I mean, you know, so the private sector was a very convenient way to encourage investment in Bombay, and that's partly because of the sort of laissez-faire attitude of the British, and partly because Bombay till 1850s was not very high on the priority of the British. They were not going to put the money in here that they did in Calcutta. Now, of course, it's completely different. That is seen as the government's preserve, and you know, the preserve of the private sector is different now.
Would you all like to comment on?
Yeah, I think Vikram raised an important point in terms of who was thought to be responsible. You know, the British were very good at setting a certain bar of what was considered good. It would be good to support female education, it would be good to build hospitals, it would be good to build nice roads, but they kind of backed away when people said, why don't you fund them? I mean, female education is a very good example. You know, from the 1830s, 1840s, you have lots of examples of British individuals, both in Britain and India, writing about, oh, these Indians, you know, they do not educate their daughters. They really should. But when, you know, again, this generation of Elphinstone graduates say, hey, we have established all these girls' schools over here, why don't you give us money? The British turned around and said, actually, I think that's your responsibility. I mean, they gave a little bit of money. They gave about, I think, 300 rupees, which, you know, was a lot in that day, but not really that much. But, you know, through the 1850s and 1860s, you have repeated attempts by Indians to basically ask the government, why aren't you supporting us? I thought you liked this. You know, please give us money. We are poor. And the British, you know, kind of wobble in terms of their commitment toward giving, you know, money behind, you know, kind of giving punch behind the rhetoric, if you will. You know, since India has got independence, you know, people have identified the government, as Vikram said, as having the responsibility for, you know, doing various services. That being said, there's still, of course, great scope, right? I mean, we are in a city where, you know, depending on the statistics you're looking at, between 40 to 50% of people live in kacha houses. We are living in a city where, you know, well, I don't want to be, slapped with a lawsuit by the BMC where there are large potholes, which, might rival, the scale and scope of, craters in other, deserts or the moon or something like that. There's a lot of scope for where businessmen can do something and can tell the government, why don't you do something? Or why don't you let us help put in some money to support particular infrastructure or businesses? It is a little sad that you do have businessmen building 27-story houses for themselves in a city where 40% of people are still living in terrible, awful accommodations. It's a little sad. And those people who are doing it should be rather ashamed of themselves. At the same time, it's not very different from what has historically been the case. I mean, obviously, businessmen built large houses for themselves, and even though Bombay was called Bombay the Beautiful about 80 years ago or so, it was still a pretty terrible place to live in for the vast majority of people.
You had Tata Palace, you had the Grand House of Bombay, so in that sense, it's not such a leap.
Of course, right. I mean, it was 26 stories shorter, and,
Yeah,
but you're right.
Tata Palace being the Deutsche Bank now building now, which you can see is really ornate. And one fascinating example of this push and pull between British wanting to realizing the need to spend and trying to encourage Indians is over clock towers. And I think Murli, you can have something to say about here, because the story of clock towers in Bombay is very fascinating. And Chirudeep Chaudhary has done a beautiful series of postcards, which I think is still available on all the clock towers of Bombay, which are now mostly decrepit, except for the Rajabaita and CST station. But from the late 19th century onwards, there's this whole need to build clock towers for a very practical reason. Most people didn't have watches. I mean, except for the Parsi, the girls who were winning in competitions. So there was a need for the people to have a way to tell the time so that they would arrive on time. So there was a clear economic need for clock towers, and the British recognized that. And they felt that yes, we need to encourage it, which is why BT Station was built with a clock tower. Rajabai Tower was built with a clock tower. At the same time, they didn't really see why they had to do it themselves. So there's always this push and pull about who is going to fund the clock tower, and especially with Rajabai Tower, there is a big debate that goes on for a long time about who is going to actually fund the. I mean, Premchand Roychand funds the tower. But who's actually going to fund the running of a clock? Because a clock needs a mechanism and goes on. And in fact, it becomes a very interesting debate over Bombay time. I mean, which is a totally different thing about what time it would actually tell. Because in that period, we're still negotiating about what is the time that these clocks are. They going to follow railway time, which is they're trying to integrate it across India, or local, the actual time in Bombay. So there's a very interesting battle that happens over Rajabai Tower in particular, and where the governor is basically saying that I will fund the tower, but it has to tell railway time. It has to tell, it has to tell the time that the British were trying to impose across India, which is the time that we still follow today. Whereas at that time, most merchants followed Bombay time, which is the actual time which now is only followed in fire temples. Any clock tower stories?
Yeah, I mean, if you see the poem which I read out, there is a clock tower right there too. I mean, here it says, Suno Ghadiali, Ghanan Ghanan, Awaz Avta Deval mein. The Deval was what is now the St. Thomas Cathedral on Horniman Circle. Kya Kalsutra? Kalsutra is the mechanism. Kya Kalsutra Kam Banaya Ghanta Baje Deval mein. So that was literally the first clock tower from perhaps I think 1838. I think when they redid the church and it became a cathedral in the 1830s, they got a clock tower there first, and from there on, I mean, Govindnarayan is totally flummoxed by this. By this amazingly huge number of clock towers, watches, the fancy watches, and so on. So because
for an economic purpose,
yeah,
it's like make people be on time, which they still aren't. But the aim was there.
Yeah, but at least they could start keeping count. I mean, otherwise you just wouldn't know. I mean, so there was the whole concept of time literally changed with the arrival of these clock towers.
Okay, and also to end, I think the Ambanis have got their knighthood, because if you go to Harkisan Das Hospital, it is now called Sir H.N. Reliance Hospital. So they have got their knighthood, so they're doing something right.
If they only put a clock down until we would forgive them everything.
Exactly. So we'd open it up for questions.
Okay. We've been talking about the families contributing to Bombay. We were talking about the various cultural milieu. Why do we forget the film industry, the film family, like for example the Kapoor family, they contributed such a lot to Bombay in terms of employment, in terms of culture, in terms of films. There is that film families, and there are a lot of other associated allied trades, the musicians, the music, the lyrics, that brought a whole thing to Bombay.
And the movie theaters. I mean, I think one has to forget that maybe the way that Bombay businessmen contributed to the film industry was by building cinema theaters. Otherwise, there would be no point in having the cinemas in the first place.
Can I think it's a wonderful point you raised. I mean, the kind of involvement of the Bombay Sethiyas with public entertainment, so to speak. I mean, the earliest instance which I could find is Tayyabji Bhoy. I mean, Tayyabji Bhoy was one of the most, I would say, progressive of businessmen of Bombay. He even wrote an autobiography. He couldn't complete it because he died before he could get past his 25th year. But his sons, Kamruddin Tayyabji and Badruddin Tayyabji became really world famous and so on and so forth. And he was a person who sent them to, long before any Parsi went to the UK to become a barrister. Kamruddin was the first person to go there, and Tayyabji accompanied him there, dropped him there, went to Hajj on the way back, and he did that 2-3 times to make sure that at least 3 of his 6 sons would get very proper Western education and come back and become very, very, very prominent people of Bombay. So this Tayyabji Bhoy, you can see him lending his palace in the native town for what was the first performance of the Bombay Hindu Dramatic Corps, which is basically which came up in response to what I think most of you know about Vishnudas Bhave and his first performances in the Bombay Grand Road Theatre in 1853. So in 1855 you have the first performance of an amateur group from Bombay doing similar stuff, Love Kush, Shakuntala, in his house as a sort of an experimental theatre for the Bombay local people, and they went on to become a professional troupe. Even Vishnudas Bhave was actually sponsored or at least supported by Bhavdaji, who was not a Sethia but part of the Bombay elite, so to speak. He was the most popular Indian doctor qualified in Western medicine, and he was the one who sort of literally handheld Bhave through his first few years before they of course split up for various reasons. And a lot of the other traveling troops, for example, all the gymnastics troops, I think the precursors of our current yoga from Mysore, would come to Bombay, and people like Jamshedji Jiji sons would have special performances organized for them in the 1850s in the Grand Road Theatre, and they would go there, and they would be the guest of honor for that event, and they would sort of perhaps give them a lump sum amount, so to speak. So you had
that's such a lovely example, because you see the Tayyabji's give you your connection with nationalism. Absolutely. Because there's a whole separate Abbas Tayyabji becomes is there at the Dandi March. He leads the Dandi, the actual assault on the Dandi March. Rehana Tayyabji is Gandhi's close associate. So all these things link up, and that also reminds me that perhaps we haven't talked about the women of Bombay enough. The women in these the really notable women, the wives, sisters, daughters, and all these business families who many times created like really remarkable institutions or wrote documents themselves. So again, that's a history that hasn't been written about enough.
Okay, can we
Thank you so much for that initial question. I was actually wondering a very basic thing, which is that we've been talking a lot about the culture, but what are these business families doing in terms of business? And is it something that is indigenous business practices that allow them to become the businesses of Bombay? Is there something about their, like say moving from Surat, for example, or is there something about their business practices that allows them to become profitable in Bombay in a way that it's not devices that we follow with Hajjari Jai and Political Council, who actually get involved in the local money business even before Bombay was set up. And my second question, to be honest, this amazing rise of merchant business in Bombay, and we're thinking about the joint enterprise, how do you kind of think of colonialism in this context, and how do you critique colonialism, and how do you kind of view that question of colonialism in a colonial country like Bombay, where the Indians actually flourish or seem to flourish in this milieu?
I think, Dinesh, you've given part of the answer to that. When, in the initial stages, the local businessmen would have been the people who got the originally opium from Malwa, then later on cotton to Bombay, and that's how they started building up the capital. Which it's after some point they started investing in the cotton mills and things themselves. So it springs from the trade, from the country, very much from the country trade of Western India. And I think again the contrast is there with Eastern India, where there is just not that space for these traders to become businessmen, except with a few cases like Tagore, like the Tagore family, for example. Whereas Bombay gave these traders the space to become, to move from just being traders to businessmen, and I think that's an important point. About colonialism, I don't know.
Dinyar, maybe you'd like to.
Yeah, sure. And I'll mention just a little bit. I'll just talk a little bit about what Vikram was mentioning also. I mean, to answer the question of why these individuals became such successful businessmen, it's because they were really good at business. Especially, Gujarati Pathshalas, these Gujarati indigenous schools, which you'd find in Bombay and of course across coastal Gujarat, were renowned for teaching children to be incredible at mathematics. Nauroji was one of these individuals who actually would be put on public display, where people would actually gather around and see how quickly you could multiply or subtract or do certain things. That was a popular form of entertainment back then. And he was but one of several thousand examples of these type of people. He even wowed British people, and not just Nauroji, but other ones. I mean, if you read a travelogue from 1838, there's a British woman called Mariana Postons who comes to Bombay, and she said, "My God, the 7-year-old boy is multiplying stuff, faster than I can imagine." So to answer your question, they were very good. They had developed strong business skills and business connections in places like Surat, and they took it to Bombay. And as Vikram had said, the latitude for them to be able to expand their businesses was much bigger than in a place like Calcutta. There's a book that's come out recently by a man called John Wilson called India Conquered, or the Chaos of Empire, depending on which edition you're looking at. And he makes a very interesting point. He says, the British controlled a lot of industry in India, but they were quite bad at it. If you looked in the actual factories that were running in places like Calcutta, there are lots of reports of, creaky machinery, stuff that's rusting. I mean, this stuff makes you think of stuff from the License Raj days, except this was before License Raj. So, they weren't necessarily very good, but they had control. So in Bombay, where there was less control, the cream kind of rose to the top. With regards to colonialism, yeah, a lot of what people have, academics or people like us have written about colonialism, kind of depicts colonialism as being kind of this, massive force that, created interlopers and created certain, intervening classes or compradors and stuff like that. I think a lot of that is, too simple-minded. As Murli had mentioned with regards to Jamshedji Jijibai, or, as we've talked about with other examples like Behramji Malbari, people could be dealing with the British on one level, but at the same time be very critical of them. Up until 1929, 1919, nationalists are still talking about a future for India that would exist within the British Empire. Not because they liked the British Empire, but because it didn't look like the British Empire was going anywhere. That mentality of being able to negotiate and not necessarily be pro-British or anti-British, but kind of modulate your position, was something that a lot of Indians pioneered, and they knew how to play the game. I mean, early nationalists like Nauroji would say, we are British subjects and we demand British rights. But that's not necessarily because they felt that, the Union Jack was the prettiest flag flying. It's because they knew that they were in a system where the British controlled everything. And if they said stuff like, British go home, they would be locked behind bars or, exiled to Burma like Tilak was.
And just to respond on your point on trading practices, I think they really continued the old trading practices to a large extent, but there was this boundary where you sort of moved on to a Western style of office management and so on. I mean, if you clearly see in Jamshedji's letters, and one day he writes to Jardine in the mid 1820s, after they have been partners for 5 years. I wish I had realized that partnering with an European agent, basically Jardine was an agent, basically not his partner, would have given me so much more profits than by having an Indian agent sitting in China selling my opium. So there was this linkages which which people are not, it was not just Jamshedji. Many of the other traders also developed linkages with European trading houses in Bombay. For example, Jamshedji sent half his consignments, half owned by Jamshedji Jijiboy Sons and Company, half owned by Remington and Company. So they were, you had his partnership, another partnership, and they would partner again on single shipment. So he would have his risks sort of all spread out over both Europeans and Indians and all over the place. So I think risk management was a major technique which he and many others used to sort of survive and prosper.
I've read that Muhammad Ali Roge, in fact, donated the land as JJ Hospital stands, but he didn't want his name to be mentioned. And he resisted that very, very strongly. And his children later on also prevented it from happening. Somebody tried to do it. I wanted to find out about the authenticity of this. And also whether Muhammad Ali Road stands for Muhammad Ali Roge Road. I wanted to check.
The second one is obviously it doesn't stand for Muhammad Ali Roge. It stands for Maulana Muhammad Ali, the Khilafat movement, one of them.
Sydenham Road, I think.
Exactly. So to go back to your first question, I don't have. I've been looking at the Jamshedji Jijiboy files on the construction of the Jamshedji Jijiboy Hospital, where all sorts of documents are available. There is absolutely no mention there of Roge having donated that land. Having said that, if you read the obituaries of Roge from 1850, all of them are very clearly saying that he did a lot of charity, but not even his family members knew what they were. Unlike, say, Jamshedji, who was very public about it, who would have booklets published about his charities and so on and so forth, by listing them by fund and so on. But for Roge, we don't have that kind of data, and I haven't found any proof of this. I don't think it's true, because if that was true, then there would be some.
Charity money he gave. The zakat, what you say.
Say that again?
He gave money, zakat, what we have in
Yeah, of course, he gave money to all sorts of charities. All that is there. For example, wherever Jamshedji would donate 500, Jamshedji would write 250 for Roge. So all that is there. But for the specific question which she asked, whether the land on which the hospital stands was given by Roge, there is no proof of that. We can repeat it.
Mention that the lady, there was some comments.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So really, the comment was this: the way Jagannath Shankar Seth exactly is being revived by parties today, and I think Khaki Tours also inaugurated one of their urban safari tours with Jagannath Shankar Seth's grandson attending. So. Yes, and the jeep is named after Jagannath Shankar Seth. It's called Nana. So. The question really was that, can you see this happening for other leading Setyas? Are other communities going to be claiming these chaps, or is it just is it just a political kind of tool? I think Parsis claim quite well, but like.
I would like to respond to this Jagannath Shankar Seth point. I think the reason why we missed him out was, I think, a pretty good reason. He really was not a business Sethia. He was a man with excellent command over English. He was a man to whom the British would go to, was a go-to man for the British government for all things Hindu. And since he had very good connections, and I think he was an extremely intelligent, extremely, worldly man. And he could survive from the early age of 20, he was already part of all the other committees, while Gigi Boy was a whole generation older than him, and most of the other people were much older. But he was the person who really held his own, and admittedly he came from a very rich family of diamond traders. I couldn't find any evidence of he himself having done that. But of course, of course, the bungalow is there. No, his father, Shankar Seth, Babul Seth, Ganba Seth, all of them were obviously diamond traders. Yeah, of course they do have property. So the point here is, there are now books being written about Jagannath Shankar Seth. He was a director of the GIPR, like many other Indians were. But there is this move to sort of making the father of Indian railways. which I think is clearly one of the points which you made about reclaiming people. And I think he's one of the people who is waiting to be reclaimed.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Bhau Daji Art Museum was renamed Bhau Daji and not Jagannath Sankar Seth. So they chose the secretary, they chose the intelligentsia over the Setya. But if there were two Marathi figures, both of them were competing for renaming of the Victoria and Albert Museum at Baikala. And it's interesting that Bhau Daji won, for whatever reason, and it wasn't named after Shankar Seth. Renamed. Zarir has a last question.
Quick question, which is you mentioned the opium trade. I know it was legitimate at the time, but could your family in any way quantify how much the growth of Bombay has been from the opium?
We could just, this is Amar Farooqi's work. We just refer you to that wonderful book, Opium City, which talks about it. Dinesh, do you want to talk about the...
You probably know much more about this than I do. I'll say it to a very small degree because I don't think I know a terribly large amount about this. Opium did contribute obviously to a very large degree to the fortunes of Bombay, but opium was only one of two really big commodities that built up Bombay. The other one was cotton. I can talk a little bit more about cotton and then let the others do more about opium. But you start to see this transition by the 1850s, 1860s, a little bit earlier, depending on which community you're looking at, between opium and cotton, the connections that these individuals had forged with opium with places like China proved to be influential also with the cotton trade, in the sense that people start doing cotton trade with places like China also. So when you think of opium, also think of cotton. Cotton's slightly less controversial than opium also, so maybe it's nicer to talk about. But I don't think I can really say much about opium.
I think opium did help the native businessmen in this area for two reasons, as opposed to say Calcutta. Where the geography meant that opium could be cultivated and controlled by the company much more closely. Here, the geography in India meant the opium was mostly in Malwa, which was not under the control of the company, and the Ghats were a significant barrier. And this is where the geography of the Western India plays a big role. So it was not easy for the British to access the opium in Malwa. So a lot of it was routed through the native traders who would bring it in horses or mules over the Ghats. So that automatically you have an intermediary over there who's making a certain level of money. The other place which is interesting for opium is Daman, because a lot of opium trade is routed through Daman. Again, that is a particular area. We tend to forget that these Goa, Daman, and were useful also to Bombay traders in ways that the native traders could exploit, that the British could not.
I think a lot has been said about the legitimacy of the opium trade. I think everybody who was part of the opium trade knew that the final leg was illegitimate. Here you would buy opium from the Indore and Gwalior governments. A lot of the princes, again, the connection there, the princes really had a major monopoly. The British tried to get it from them. They tried very hard in the 1820s. Our governor of Bombay, John Malcolm, was really extremely keen on having an opium monopoly in central India too. But I think the power dynamics and the the diffuse nature of the land. You had villages belonging to Gwalior, Indore, Holkar, and so on all over the place, and many other smaller kingdoms also. So they could never establish a monopoly, but they kept on increasing the so-called pass fees. Every chest of opium had to have a pass. When they finally decided that they had spent enough money on getting a monopoly but could not get it, they started a pass fees, which increased from say 100 rupees per chest to almost as high as 800 in a period of almost say 20 years, from 1830 to 1850. So the quantum of the cut which the British Empire had from each opium chest which went through Bombay kept on increasing as a proportion of the final price. And they would send it off to China, and they would have an agent there. For example, Jamshedji in his last 2 decades had Jardine Matheson, the Jardine group, which still exists in Hong Kong. And so they were just the agent. So until it was sold to a Chinese buyer, the Indian Sethia was the owner, and the Chinese buyer was doing an illegal thing by getting it into China because the Chinese government had stopped it. So to say that it was legitimate in India and illegitimate only in China was to just literally just hoodwink yourself. So they were all doing illegitimate stuff, including the British Empire, to a certain extent. And to answer your specific question, I would say that opium was just one of the many trades, but to put just a quick off-the-ball number, I would say at least in the first few decades, up to the 1860s, I think the so-called prosperity of Bombay was 1/4 opium at least, if nothing else.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Asad, Ursula, Aisha, Zoya, and the whole Avid Learning team for putting this event together. Thanks.
Thank you.
And on behalf of Avid Learning, we would obviously like to thank our wonderful panelists for a very, very fascinating discussion. Thank you to the NGAMA for partnering with us to bring you this event. Thank you, audience, as always, for being engaged, for being here on Morcha Day. And do look forward for many more exciting programs from Avid, including an art appreciation workshop and a fashion photography workshop. For more, visit social media. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.